Good morning. Welcome back, everybody. Welcome to our last lecture in this course. So what we're going to do today is we're going to discuss what... It's pretty loud, isn't it? Why is that? Was it just as usual? Okay, I think now it works. Good. So today we're going to wrap up by discussing what all this, what we've discussed to some extent, means for democracy and the nation state. So this course, IPE, is very much about globalization, right? The increase and decline of trade over time and variation in trade in different countries. It's about the increase of capital account openness and what this means for the interplay between exchange rates and domestic autonomy. And domestic autonomy, to some extent, is a really important feature for democratic politics. Because if voters want that the government influences the economy in some way or another, this means that the government needs to have the capacity to do so. It needs to have monetary autonomy or economic autonomy. So we're going to discuss what this all means for democratic politics. And here I'm going to talk about the debate that you probably heard about. It's about the debate whether globalization undermines democracy or whether this democratic politics continues to work in open economies. And I'm going to quickly show the different ends, the different poles of this debate and discuss how this debate evolved over time and what the key claims are. And then I'm going to devote most of the time on evidence. We're going to work through the causal mechanism of the different arguments and look at empirical data to see whether it's actually empirical data is consistent or against one or the other mechanism. And in the second part, I'm going to talk about how this all reflects in voting. In the end, the central part of democratic politics is elections and voting. Now the question is, to what extent does all this globalization affect voting behavior by citizens? So the guiding question today is very simple. It's what are the effects of openness on nation states and democratic politics? And let's first look at openness, because this will be important in a moment. So how can we look at to what extent countries are open and how this varies over time? So one way to look at it is by measuring to what extent countries and governments restrict international capital flows. And this is, so if you look at such a legal indicator, we call that the euro openness, and this is from a paper by Dennis Quinn, who collected a lot of data on regulations with regard to international capital flows over time in different countries. So how can we do that? I already mentioned this IMF report on exchange rate arrangement and exchange restrictions. So that's where we got the data about exchange rate regimes that countries have. And in the same report, the IMF also publishes what countries say to what extent they restrict international capital flows. And here we can look at, so for instance, it measures to what extent it's not allowed for foreign citizens or foreign firms to buy government bonds, to buy stocks of a firm in a particular country and so on. Or to what extent it's not allowed to buy a home in another country or to invest, to build a factory in another country, right? So that would be capital openness. And then what Quinn does, he simply counts the amount of the amount of restrictions that he sees in these reports and makes an indicator that varies from 0 to 14. So no country has 0, so no country is fully closed. But we see in the 1950s the mean, so this is the mean and the median of all OECD countries, was very small, was very low. It was around 4, which means economies were highly closed. There were a lot of restrictions on capital flows. And then over time, this increases, and by 2000, all countries are fully open. So this is the standard deviation of capital account openness in OECD countries, which means that if the standard deviation, so that's the average deviation from the mean, which means if the standard deviation is large, we see a lot of heterogeneity across countries with respect to capital account openness. And if this declines, that means everybody starts to do the same, or countries do more and more. They converge on the same policy, which is openness. Right? Now the point here is that this increases linearly, and by 1980 and 1990, OECD countries were almost fully open. Now the question is, how does this reflect in actual flows? And the picture looks a bit different, and this will be important in a moment when we talk about the existing studies and their conclusion about the effect of openness on state capacity. So this is actual capital flows. This simply measures the proportion of portfolio investment flows, and portfolio investment flows are small, short-term investment flows, those that can change direction at any time. So that would be an investment in a stock market, and you could sell that stock at any moment and withdraw your capital from this economy. That's different from fixed investments, which you cannot liquidize as easily. But the two correlate heavily. But so this is portfolio investment flows over GDP, and that's the mean and the median, and they diverge. I'm going to say in a moment why. But what we see is that this increased slightly in the 1980s and even more in the 1990s, and it literally exploded in the late 1990s and early 2000s, right? So the mean is much higher than the median because there's some countries are outliers. So outliers are reflected. Countries which have a massive portfolio investment flow relative compared to other countries. And outliers are reflected in the mean, but much less in the median. And these outliers are, for instance, Luxembourg, which have a massive amount of capital flows compared to GDP, or Switzerland as well, right? So those are the countries that push the mean upward, but in any case, the median also moves in the same direction in the same period of time. What this means is that countries are legally open in the 1980s, but it's not reflected in actual capital flows. So this openness only starts to be reflected in actual flows in the late 1990s. And that will be important in when we look at the studies, because many of the early studies, whether globalization constrains nation states, many of these early studies stopped in the 1990s, in the early or mid-1990s, and they concluded, oh, there's no problem. But, as we see here, the real constraints of financial markets on democracy only start to materialize afterwards, after these studies stopped. That's going to be an important point today. So what are these two different views? Well, the first one says, and that was the first critique of globalization, in the 1990s said that, well, the state is not able to cope with financial constraints anymore, and financial openness and globalization and financial flows are constraining the economy in a way that democracy doesn't work anymore. So that's a supply side argument that says globalization undermines autonomy, and the causal mechanism is quite simple. Basically says that when capital is mobile, it will just go wherever the return is highest, right? So this means that there will be competition for capital, which leads to tax competition. So what are the main obstacles for returns? So by this argument, it's taxes. And taxes are needed to finance welfare states. So if you want to provide social insurance through welfare states to your citizens, you need to keep taxes high, or at least at a minimum level. And this is now so welfare states are inhibiting competition, and that means, and at the same time we will see deregulation. Another obstacle to high returns is labor rights, conditions that improve workers' work situation, and so ultimately we will see deregulation and labor union decline over time. So that's the idea here. And this is reflected in a statement by Susan Strange, who said in the 1990s, the impersonal forces of world markets are now more powerful than states, to whom ultimate political authority over society and economy is supposed to belong. Where states were once the masters of markets, now it is the markets which in many critical issues are masters of the governments of states. So what are the implications here? What should we see? So if this is true, what should we see empirically? How could we test this? Well, the first implication is that we see a shift of the burden away from capital taxation. If capital is mobile and citizens are much less mobile, there's many more restrictions on movement of people, not within the EU, but across across countries in general outside the EU. While capital is highly mobile, what we should see is that the more immobile factors should be taxed more, and that's citizens. So labor taxation or income taxation should increase, while capital taxation should decline. That's one implication that we should see. The other is a more general convergence in policies towards a minimal level. So that's the race to the bottom argument. So we should see a race to the bottom in taxation, or at least capital taxation, but not only. We should also see a race to the bottom in labor regulations, potentially in environmental regulations, all kinds of regulations that present obstacles to profitability of capital. And ultimately, that leads to, by this argument, to shallow democratic politics, at least in the economic sphere, because governments cannot pursue distinct economic policies that are in line with the demands of their citizens. Ultimately, this means that we have a lack of accountability. If citizens demand something, governments cannot provide this. So if citizens demand more social insurance, governments cannot provide this social insurance, and then voting, at least in the economic sphere, becomes meaningless. What could be a critique to this? What could be an argument why all this doesn't materialize in reality? Why should we not see, or why is it possible that we don't see such a race to the bottom? So if you're an investor, right, if you're a firm, what do you care about? You care about taxes, of course. Is there anything else you care about? And if so, what? Yeah. Excuse me? So you care about social stability potentially, right? Here you have a collective action problem, but as a whole, so the economy as a whole should care in some ways about social stability. What else would you care about? If you just think about profitability, what influences your profitability most, apart from taxes? So there's a lot of other risks. So there's political risk associated with many economies outside the OECD, right? So there's government changes, policy changes much more radically in emerging markets. There's a greater risk of financial crisis in emerging markets. So there's other risks that potentially undermine profitability and which you need to take into account apart from taxation. So there is still restricted mobility, and there's a home bias. We see de facto that there's a home bias in investment. There's political risks in emerging markets, which then lead to economic risk in terms of financial crisis. And all this, the taxation or the labor cost argument and labor regulation only applies to labor-intensive industries. But if you're in a capital-intensive industry, which doesn't use that much labor, then actually other factors like the environment for research and development and all kinds of other factors innovate that promote your innovation capacity, good universities, and so on are more important than just labor regulation. So this led to this alternative view, which is a demand-side argument. And here, it's all about what voters want. So now, before we talked about what firms want. That's the supply-side argument. Now we talk about what voters want. And here the argument is that before we actually, or to actually gain the support of voters, and voters could potentially oppose globalization, and they can vote for parties who would who propose more protectionism and who propose more capital controls. And to avoid that, what we need to make sure is that voters are insured against the increased social risks that arise with globalization. So that's a compensation argument, that compensation of voters for increased social risk is actually a precondition for globalization. And I'm going to show you some empirical patterns which are pretty strong and pretty surprising as well, that are in line with this argument. So, globalization increases social risk. So in which way? How does globalization increase social risk? What about the course, what about the previous sessions would fall under this kind of social risk? Yeah.
Some people lose their jobs, the less abundant factor, people working in less abundant factor, which is not exported, they lose their jobs.
Exactly. So it's all about distributional consequences of trade and financial flows. So some people win, some people lose. And by just already in the model by Ricardo, what we discovered there, or what we learned there, is that the economies as a whole, they might win, but there's one sector that will disappear, and people working in this sector, they will lose their jobs. They need retraining and so on. They need to go to another, find work somewhere else. So that's an increased social risk. So those voters will object against trade. So what you need to do is you need to insure the voters against risks to gain support for openness. And that was actually the dominant argument in the late 1990s. There's this famous book by Geoffrey Garrett who says that social democracy will become more important with globalization because social democratic parties are offering this compensation and insurance against social risks. So he said it is hard to make the case that globalization constraints are pervasive or even the norm. Indeed, there are numerous instances in which various facets of market integration have been associated with both more interventionist government policies and greater divergence of national trajectories over a range of policy areas. So it's exactly the opposite. And that was the dominant view in international political economy in the late 90s and 2000s. So what are the implications? So if you want to test this argument, what should we look at? Well, we should look at to what extent welfare states have been declining. We should not see a race to the bottom in taxation or environmental regulation or in labor regulation. Left parties could potentially benefit from globalization because they offer the policies that the losers of globalization want, and therefore democracy should actually work. So the critique here is just the other way around. So it ignores the supply side, while the supply side argument has ignored the demand side. And it assumes that countries coordinate internationally to avoid tax competition, for instance. So what it basically means is that countries have an incentive for tax competition, but they are able to coordinate and prevent that that one country's free riding and decreasing taxes while all the others try to keep them stable. Good. So let's look at some of the implications empirically. And this is, again, a small graph, so I'm going to make it bigger. So this is from a famous paper by Danny Roderick. And what he does is he looks at the correlation between openness. So this is openness in the 1980 to 1989. So this is the percent of trade over GDP. So countries like the US and Japan, they are fairly big, so they trade a lot. But compared to their GDP, it's not a lot, right? So they're fairly close by this measure. So they have 20% of trade over GDP. And on the y-axis, we have government expenditure in this period, or after this period, actually. That's from 1990 to 1992. And what we see is that we see a strong positive correlation between openness and government spending. So that means that the more countries are open, the bigger governments they have, right? So the supply side argument would have said, if countries are more open, they face more competition. That's why they have smaller governments. But it's exactly the other way around. And it's very strong, and it's very robust, at least in this period. So more open governments have, more open countries have more spending. And that's consistent with the compensation thesis. And that's exactly Roderick's argument. He says that countries who want to be open, they need to make sure that their citizen is protected against social risk. Otherwise, this is not going to work. So this is OECD countries. He looked at this for all countries, and he's controlling for all kinds of other factors that could affect government spending. And he looks at, again, openness from the 1970s to 1980s, and then government consumption in the same countries in the late 1980s, and you see a very strong and positive relationship between these two variables. So that came as a surprise, right? So if we start from the idea that globalization is highly constraining, we could not find this, right? So this was strong evidence against the race to the bottom argument. So let's go a bit deeper. So that's a big correlation, right? That's just the relationship between the starting point, which is globalization, and the end point, which is spending. What else could we look at to look at these these arguments? So how could you explore this argument further, or should we stop here? Yeah. Exactly, who's paying for it? Who's being taxed, right? So there was this argument that we should see a shift in the tax burden, so we could look at the tax burden. What else could we look at? Yeah. So one argument would be that left-wing governments win, so they should be in power more often. Exactly. What else could we look at? Yeah. Yeah, how is this money spent? Exactly, so that's something we could look at. Any other thoughts? Yeah? We could look at whether governments accumulate more debt. So that would mean that you're kind of trapped in between both. You want to spend a lot, so you spend a lot, as we see here, but at the same time you cannot tax firms anymore. So that means the deficit should increase. That would mean that we are in both worlds, basically. Yeah, so that's, so there's, what we could look at, so whether the argument applies in the same way to industrialized and developing countries, But we could look at the causal chain, right? We can start at the very beginning. We can look at whether we actually see that those people who are exposed to more social risk, whether they actually demand more redistribution. That's the start. That's the very beginning, right? So it's all about its demand side. It's a demand side argument. So let's look at demand by voters. That's one thing we could look at. We could look at to what extent we could expand this a bit and look more in the future to what extent state capacity prevails, right? This was openness in the 70s and 80s. Let's look at whether this prevails in the 1990s, 2000, and 2010. And then we can actually look at what are the real financial constraints. We could ask financial market participants what they care about when they evaluate governments and when they decide whether they want to lend money to governments. So let's first look at demand. So this is from a paper by Rehm, who uses a survey which is called the European Social Survey. And the European Social Survey is being implemented on a regular basis every year and in all European countries. So what's been done is that you take a random sample of voters in each country, so 1,000, 2,000 voters in each country, and you ask them a set of questions about about their political attitudes, about their preferred economic policy, and so on. And what Rehm looked at is the question on redistribution. To what extent do voters demand redistribution? So the specific question is, please say to what extent you agree or disagree with the following statement. The government should take measure to reduce differences in income levels. And then the answers differ from I strongly disagree to I strongly agree. And then he looks at which variable explain most variation across voters in their demand for redistribution. And what's not surprising is that the richer you are, the bigger your household income, the less you agree with redistribution. Now that's not surprising. But what's important for us is that if you work in a profession where unemployment rate is high, you demand more redistribution. If you have a lower educational degree, so this is about skills, you demand more redistribution. And if your skills are specific to a sector, if specificity increases, then you demand more redistribution. So remember what we talked about in week 5 when we talked about the attitudes towards protectionism and free trade. We found that skill level was really crucial to understand the support for free trade. And we see the same equivalent pattern here. Skill specificity and the skill level, which are the factors that explain to what extent you benefit from trade, explain to what extent you want redistribution, right? So this is in line with the compensation thesis. If your personal characteristic mean that you're exposed to greater social risk, if there's more trade, then you demand compensation for this increased risk. So the first step is confirmed. The first step of the causal mechanism of the compensation thesis. Now let's look what states actually can do. So let's look at the tax rate and spending. I'm giving you the numbers that Garrett in his famous book pulled out. And I'm giving you a number for a selected number of countries, for a selected set of countries. So Australia and US, those are what's often called the liberal market economies. They always had historically a much lower spending level than other countries because they have smaller welfare states. Then we have the European continental model, which is Germany, Austria, but also France and Italy would fall in this category. So they have an intermediate spending level. And then we have got the Scandinavian model, which always had very big welfare states and governments. So what he looked at is whether spending and the tax rate in these countries, how they evolved in the 1990s and in the 1980s and 1990s. And spending increased in all countries until 1994. So he stops, for the tax rate, he stops in 1992. And for the spending rate, he stops in 1994. And we see huge increases in the Scandinavian countries. We saw big increase in all other countries as well. What do we see in terms of taxation? So we see an increase in taxation in Australia. We see a slight increase in taxation in the US, but tax rates in these countries are fairly high. Those are corporate tax rates. So this is taxation on of capital. We see an increase in the tax rate in Austria, and we see an increase in the tax rate in Sweden. And Garrett concluded from this that there's no problem, state capacity has not declined. So does that match what you see, what you feel, or what would you do here? What's the problem? Yeah.
There is no rule, I think.
Excuse me?
There is no rule.
There's no what?
There is no rule.
What kind of rule?
For example, we categorize Denmark, Sweden, Australia, and the United States. But for example, in the United States, it's below 0. In Australia, it's plus. But in Sweden and Denmark, it's changed also. I mean, there is no specific rule.
You mean no specific pattern in terms of how it, yeah, so there's no clear pattern. Well, there's a pattern in spending, right? With taxation, there's no clear pattern with taxation. There is a pattern with spending, which is there's an increase in spending until the 90s. But it's true that for taxation, it's already less clear. But I think we can say there's no race to the bottom, right? If we stay at 40%, it's not the bottom. But how do countries, so when you think about tax competition, how do countries actually, how has tax competition evolved or since then? So this assumes, well, there's a country and it sets taxation unilaterally, but different countries have different competitors. And you could see that in the 2000s, in 2004 with EU enlargement. So in 2004, there was the EU Eastern enlargement when Hungary, for instance, Czech Republic, the Baltic countries entered the EU. And with this, what we saw is that Austria, for instance, started to decrease capital taxation in response to Hungary's entry, which had a lower capital taxation rate. Finland responded to Estonian tax rates because the Estonian tax rate was lower, and Finland saw Estonia as the main competitor when it comes to to competition for investments. So not every country competes against every country, and countries respond selectively and strategically to the tax rates of specific other countries, not to all the rest of the world. And this is a process that just plays out that just plays out over time with much more delay than we see here. And remember that capital flows actually increased only in the period when Garrett stopped his analysis. So those studies stopped too soon. So if we go further, until at least until 2005, and we could extend this until today, what we see is, so this is Australia, this is Australia, Sweden. We see this sharp increase in spending until the 1990s, and then it declined. So there's an increase to the peak in the 1990s by 74%, but then we see a decline by 15%. We see the same in Austria. We see an increase to the peak by 61% until the 1990s, and then we see a decline by 13%. We see the same in Sweden. We see a massive increase by more than 100% to the peak in the 1980s and 90s, and then we see a decline by 21%. So they stopped too soon. And tax competition only set in after these early studies were published. So we see strategic responses to competitors, which happens with more delay than the race to the bottom argument is assumed. And if we look at the shift of the tax burden, that was another issue that we said we should look at. We see a similar pattern. So this is the average. This is OECD countries on average in the tax differential between capital and labor and capital. So this is 1960, and this is 1996. So this is 0, this is negative, and this is positive. So the difference means that it's the average taxation of labor income minus the average taxation of capital income. If this number is negative, that means that capital is taxed more than labor. If this number is positive, this means that labor is taxed more than capital. And we see that in the 1960s until the early 1970s, this number was negative, which means that in this period, on average, capital was taxed more than labor. Then we saw a shift where it fluctuates around 0, becomes positive, but it's around 0. So that means, on average, more or less, capital and labor are taxed in the same manner. And then, from the 1990s onwards, we see this sharp increase, which means now labor is taxed more than capital. So we do see a shift in the burden in taxation away from capital towards labor, which is consistent with this idea that that states are more constrained with globalization. Let's look at the last issue here, which is, again, comes to a very positive conclusion about the constraints, but if you look at it a bit more closely, we have to qualify this conclusion again. So there's this famous paper by Lena Mosley who looked at what do investors actually care. Because again, one part of the mechanism is that financial constraints arise because those who give money to governments, who lend money to governments, they constrain them in a way that they cannot pursue distinct economic policies. So Mosley went to financial centers in London. So she goes to big firms in London, big financial firms, JP Morgan and so on, Deutsche Bank and so on, and she asks investors, financial bond traders, what they care about when they decide whether they want to lend money to a government or not. So she just lists the indicators that were mentioned. So inflation was mentioned by 71% of them as a crucial indicator that they look at when they invest money into government bonds. The fiscal deficit was mentioned by 76%. The level of debt, public debt, was mentioned by 50%. How the money is spent is, so whether you spend it into investment or into consumption or into welfare states, is mentioned by 70%. Who governs, whether it's a left or right government, was only mentioned by less than 50%, and elections are mentioned by 57%. However, there's an agreement that only inflation and deficits are important. So among those who mention a particular indicator, who mention inflation, most of them say this is important. Among those who mention deficits, most of them say it's important. And among those who mention who governs, who mention government partisanship, only 5% is important. So they pretend not to care about whether government is social democratic or conservative or whatever. So what she concludes from this is that investors care less about policy variation. They care about headline indicators, especially the deficit and inflation. And once you got that right, if you have a low level of inflation, and if you have a low deficit, then you can do whatever you want within these constraints. So she concludes there are strong constraints, but they're very narrow. They only concern the level of inflation, they only concern about fiscal deficits, and nothing else. So it's clearly different in the developing world, but this is at least what she concludes for industrialized countries. So does that match what you observe? How else could you look at this? How else could you look at what the actual constraints are? Well, you can look at how financial markets respond to elections, to government partisanship, and to all these other potential indicators that might matter, right? So by this, if this is true, what you should see is that elections do not influence financial markets much, right? Because if you don't care about who governs, why should you look at elections, right? And there's a lot of research on exactly this question, on how do markets respond. So there's an R missing. How do markets respond to politics? So I did one of them, but there's many more. And what you do find is that financial markets respond massively to elections. And they respond massively to who wins the election. And systematically, if the probability that the left government wins, this leads to a decline in stock prices, and this leads to an increase in interest rates. And you see that across countries and across the world. And here are a few examples. So the French election in 1980, I think it was in 1981 actually, 1980, between Giscard d'Estaing and Mitterrand had a big impact on the financial market. And I'm going to show you in a moment how. You see that in the US presidential election of 2000, that was Gore against Bush. And you see that, for instance, in the German election in 2001, which was Schröder against Stoiber. And this is the result from France. So this is the French stock market index, the CAC. And you see how it's stable over time. There's some volatility before the election. So this vertical line here is the election date when Giscard d'Estaing ran against Mitterrand. And then the outcome, I think, was 49 against 51% in favor of Mitterrand. And what you see is a massive decline in the stock prices. So this is so the dashed line is the return, so the percentage change of the stock price index. And this is on this y-axis. So you see that the stock market dropped by more than 10% when Mitterrand won the election. And you see this continuous decline, which is just the level of this indicator. This is on this y-axis. It declined massively, and it stayed low after the election of Mitterrand. So what this means is this confirms what Moseley found, that supposedly investors don't care about who governs. But clearly this finding contradicts this claim, right? So there's strong constraints on different types of governments, especially left governments, and they are closely watched by investors, and they do punish governments by withdrawing capital if they don't pursue the policy that are in the interest of financial markets. So constraints do exist, and they are fairly strong. And if this is industrialized countries, right, where party platforms of the main political parties don't diverge that much. But if you go to the developing countries, this effect is even stronger. And this is then even bigger once we have in a period of economic volatility. So if you have a crisis, or if you just had a crisis, the role of politics and constraints is even bigger than what we've just seen. So to conclude for now is we can conclude that, so we have these two polar views that there's a massive effect of globalization on democratic politics, while the other polar view says, well, it's not big because we see a demand for compensation. If you look at the data really carefully, step by step, what we see is that there was no race to the bottom as predicted by the early literature. There is a demand for compensation by potential losers of globalization. However, if we look at it really carefully, we see that there are more constraints on governments than the initial conclusion was about the relationship between globalization and state capacity. So the constraints materialize just more slowly than we previously thought. And the capacity of governments to actually compensate losers of globalization has been declining over time. And that then ties back to what we discussed in the fifth week when we talked about the effect of trade on voting, especially in the United States. So we see losers from globalization, we see a decline in state capacity, a decline in compensation, which then leads to populist backlash in voting behavior and towards more polarization of political systems, and also effects, for instance, like Brexit, could be partially explained by the effect of globalization on the losers of globalization. Good, so I'm going to stop here, come back in 15 minutes, 20 past 11, and then we're going to talk a bit more about voting and what this all means for voting behavior before we conclude. Okay, let's move on. So, the final question that I'm going to ask in this course is, how does then globalization affect voting if we assume that there are significant constraints on the government? Or in some other ways, what this does is it actually assesses what voters think the constraints on governments are. And if globalization constrains governments massively, it basically means that you should not hold governments accountable for economic outcomes, right? Because if governments can't influence these outcomes as they could in the past, you shouldn't punish governments or reward governments for these. So we talked about economic voting already a few weeks ago when we talked about the Bretton Woods system and monetary and exchange rate politics. Let me just quickly review again and put this in a broader perspective what this literature says. There's a huge literature on whether and how voters reward and punish governments for the economy. But the mechanism is actually not that simple. Also, the results are somewhat diverse. So we can have different types of voting, and all are fairly reasonable in some ways. So the first one is retrospective or prospective. So voters could, and actually do, hold governments responsible for past outcomes. So that's retrospective voting. But in some ways that doesn't make too much sense if you think that you're choosing a new leader, a government for the future, right? So that would be prospective voting if you decide on what the future economic performance will be. Then you can choose a leader based on how much this leader influenced your personal income or sociotropic economic factors. So sociotropic means national or community level outcomes. So growth for the whole country, inflation in the whole country. Personal income would simply mean your personal income growth during the past year, for instance. Then you could use objective or subjective indicators if you want to examine to what extent economic outcomes affect voting behavior. You could look at how is the actual growth rate. That's an objective outcome, right? And how does it influence voting behavior? Or subjective evaluations of voters. You could ask voters, what do you think? How has the economy been developing in the last year? And you use that as an indicator. So what the research in general finds is that subjective indicators are the strongest ones, the strongest predictor of vote behavior. Both personal and sociotropic factors matter a lot. And it's all about retrospective voting. Prospective voting doesn't really take place so much. So how do we explain this? There's different mechanisms that we can imagine. So voters could, so as I just said, voters could either hold policymakers accountable for the past performance, or they could think about what will this leader bring in the future, or they could combine the two. And that's something we did a few weeks ago already, right? This is voters infer information about policymaker competence and therefore future performance based on past outcomes. So if you have an incumbent government and you see that this so you're uncertain about the competence of this policymaker or this government, and you want to make sure, so you want to learn something about this policymaker. So you learn about the competence of this policymaker based on past performance, right? So those are the possible mechanisms. There's one problem, and this will play into our analysis of globalization, but there's a more general literature on the problem of responsibility attribution. So to punish a leader, a policymaker, you need to be sure that this leader is actually responsible for this outcome. what could blur the responsibility attribution? Which factors could actually make you unsure whether what you see in terms of the economy actually tells you something about the policymaker that you have to choose now? So what are the factors that blur responsibility attribution? Think about Switzerland. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. So you've got the major parties are in there, and they're all commonly responsible for the outcomes, right? So Switzerland is a very peculiar case, but how does that then play into other countries? Where should we see more responsibility attribution? Where should we see less? Yeah.
Maybe there would be more responsibility attribution in first past the post countries, because there's one majoritarian party that does all the policy, whereas in countries such as Switzerland or Germany, where it's proportional voting, there's several parties responsible for policy.
Exactly. So majoritarian system produce 2 or maybe 3 party systems, right? So Britain would be an example, or the United States. In the US, you have two major parties. In Britain, you've got 2 major parties, and the Liberal Democrats, which are not too important most of the time. Maybe UKIP has 1 seat in parliament. So you have the government is mostly just 1 party. So it's really clear which party is responsible for the outcome and which one is not. That's one of the most important aspects. So divided government is something different. In the presidential system, the parliament could be dominated by a different party than the government. So in the United States, the president could be of a different party than the party that's dominating Congress, right? So that's divided government. That's not possible in a parliamentary system where the government is elected out of the government or out of the parliament. Bicameral systems are important. So in Britain, there's only 1 chamber of parliament, which is important, which is the lower house. But in Switzerland, or also Germany, and the United States, you have 2 chambers, and they could be dominated by different parties. And if that's the case, then you cannot really attribute responsibility to 1 party again. Coalition governments, and that's related to what you said. In majoritarian system, you have 2 major parties, and 1 will form the government. But in a proportional system, to get a majority, a number of parties have to form a coalition, and then it's not clear which of the parties is responsible, how much for the outcome. Right? Central bank independence takes away a big tool, an important tool of economic policy, and therefore should blur responsibility attribution. So those are the key factors. And in a moment, we're going to make the same argument about globalization. Right? Globalization, if it constrains the government, it basically makes it unclear who's responsible for economic outcomes in more globalized economies. Right? But for now, what I quickly want to show you is how this plays out in practice. So this is results from 160 surveys in different countries. So again, like the European social surveys, there's regular surveys in different countries that ask people, what do you think, how well is the economy doing, and who would you vote for? So these are 19 countries and 160 surveys, so we have about 8 surveys per country, and these plots here just summarize what the effect is. So this is, just look at this small line here within this box. This shows you the median effect of the economy on vote behavior. And then what's around is how this effect differs from survey to survey. Right? So within a country, you have 8 surveys, and the effect that we see of the economy on voting varies from survey to survey. But what we care about is how much it varies, so how big this box is, and where the median effect is. So this is New Zealand, and what you see is, so this is Prime Minister vote responding to economic perceptions that move 1 unit in worse direction. So if a person says that it thinks that the economy was getting worse in the past year, you see a massive loss in votes. So minus 10% in New Zealand, that's the median. In Sweden, you see about minus 9%. And this is then getting less and less and less in Denmark, Greece, Austria, Italy, Netherlands, and Belgium. And that confirms the responsibility attribution argument, which is that in New Zealand, in the UK, especially in Canada, it's easier to attribute responsibility to the Prime Minister party than, for instance, in Belgium. So in Belgium, the government is highly constrained. You've got those two regions and who have a lot of power on the regional level, and the national government, there's a lot of veto players who constrain the government in terms of what it can do. And therefore, voters do not hold the Belgian government as responsible as a British voter. How does this look over time? So this from 1979 to 2001, we see a slight increase in economic voting, so a stronger effect of a negative economy on voting. In the 80s, it goes up and goes down again. So we don't see a clear pattern over time, right? But now let's look at globalization. Globalization should play into this, into voting behavior in different ways depending on which view we take, right? If you take the compensation view, then we would think, well, there's no problem. We should not see a decline in economic voting if state capacity is large, right? We should only see a decline in voting, in economic voting, in the relationship between the economy and the vote, if there's a lot of constraints and voters understand that they're not able, that they should not hold the government responsible for economic outcomes because the government is not responsible for it. So those are the two arguments that are that we can get out of this debate in terms of voting, and that's the paper by Helvig and Samuels, which is required reading for today, says that the constraints view, that's the race to the bottom argument, says accountability should decline when globalization causes a loss of domestic control over the economy. And actually, policymakers can use globalization as a strategic device. They could try to claim credit for good news, but avoid blame for bad news. But if the state capacity still exists, we should see that accountability persists, because governments can still make a difference in this compensation argument, in this compensation world, and sophisticated voters should be able to distinguish between those outcomes that are due to international factors and those that are because of government action. So again, what they do is they look at 560 elections in 75 democracies since 1975, and they look at how does globalization then affect economic voting. And that's the key result. And that result has been replicated by other studies as well. So here we see trade as a share of GDP. So a fully closed economy would have no trade. An open economy has a trade share that's about as big as its GDP, right? So the bigger the number here, the greater globalization from the perspective of a particular country. There's more trade. And what this shows is the coefficient on the economic variable on how it explains voting behavior. So this means that if the economy is doing better, how much does that increase the vote share for the incumbent party, right? So here's 0. If this is positive, it means that if the economy is doing better, the incumbent party gets more votes. And if this is 0, it basically means if the economy is doing better, it has no effect on the votes for the Prime Minister party. And what we see is that this effect is strongly declining as openness increases. So in fairly closed economies, we see a strong positive effect of good economic performance on the vote share for the government. But in fully open economies, this effect has disappeared. So that means that's consistent with the constraints view. Again, voters do not think that governments should not be held responsible for economic performance because globalization constrains them too much. So we have a similar but weaker result for financial openness. So this is for trade openness, this is for financial openness. So what do we conclude? So clearly the early fears that we see a massive race to the bottom, there's global competition for capital and that reduces tax rates and labor standards and environmental standards, is not true. This race to the bottom, as it was initially predicted, has not happened. There was no serious fiscal retrenchment in the sense that welfare states have been abolished. However, this initial consensus that there's no problem at all was too optimistic. So there are serious pressures. They just express themselves more slowly over time than the initial pessimistic view thought. So we do see serious constraints imposed on governments by globalization, reducing their willingness or capacity to compensate losers, which now, and that's a fairly new phenomenon, feeds into populist backlash, a greater polarization in political systems where we have more extreme views of the main parties, and that destabilizes these political systems. And you can really, there are studies that trace the rise of Trump and Brexit with the effect of globalization on the particular regions that voted in favor of these options. So we can see, so the problem, so the effect of globalization on democratic politics is fairly severe. It just manifests itself really, really slowly, right? Good, with this, I'm going to conclude with this pessimistic outlook. So I hope you enjoyed it, you learned something, and I'll leave you and wish you happy holidays. And I'm going to see you again in a month when we have the exam. So see you then.